Welcome to the St. Louis Regional Freightways Freight Week STL 2020. This is our final day of Freight Week 2020, and we're going to focus on post-COVID trends for industrial user site selection. Freight Week is a tradition of bringing together industry leaders to support the freight industry and innovation. Due to social distancing requirements, we moved to a virtual format. Our guest today, Doug Rasmussen, is very familiar with the St. Louis Regional Freightway. Doug is the president and CEO at Steadfast City Economic and Community Partners and has worked with the Freightway over the last couple of years, helping raise awareness of the region's freight assets and streamlining the process for site selectors. Doug is a leader in the industrial user market with over 20 years of experience in the transportation logistics, real estate industries, specializing in site selection and economic development at a national level. Late winter of this year, we asked Doug to interview industry leaders to better understand the region's strengths for supporting the manufacturing and logistics industries and the overall market. Today's discussion will include information from some of those conversations, as well as Doug's perspective of the industrial user market post-COVID. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
All right. Well, first, we're going to focus on an interview that you just had with JLL David Branding, the managing director of their St. Louis office. And that discussion focused on Midwest opportunities that could result from COVID-related deglobalization and how this region's industrial real estate market stands ready to accommodate these shifts. Most of that conversation focused on our freight assets and our robust industrial user market that continues to support global companies like Worldwide Technologies, General Motors, and the inland waterway industry. Today, we focus on the same topic, but different perspective. Based on the last several weeks of interviews and your perspective of the sudden shifts in the industrial real estate market, you've identified two post-COVID trends for this industry. What's the first trend?
Yeah, so the first trend is I would say is an industrial site selection trend, but it's also a general site selection trend, and that is, when we think about corporate headquarters, we're seeing a complete disaggregation of headquarters as it relates to needing to be near a hub airport. So the common knowledge or the common thinking in the past was St. Louis might be at a disadvantage because, several years ago, TWA, then American Airlines, dehubbed our airport. And, being a little bit more of a spoke as opposed to a hub would be a disadvantage. Obviously, with the disruption under COVID-19 that we've had and the travel restrictions and the perceived risk of the virus, that's something that certainly would be driving away from a hub airport. But it's actually more than that as well. So, companies, I think, understand now more than ever, really, over the last 8 weeks, they've shifted dramatically from, doing in-person, meetings, in-person sales calls to teleconferencing. And actually, this was already a trend, even prior to COVID-19. So one of the things that Bunge told us, they moved their headquarters from New York to St. Louis. And one of the things that they told us was that, increasingly they had starting to see some parity in travel prices, relative to flights from New York versus St. Louis. And so even with the added travel time of connecting from a spoke to a hub, they were getting parity. The other thing that they noticed too was that, the various assets that they felt, company assets that they felt they had to visit, in person, being near a hub airport, it was easy just to fly and go see them. And then after they moved, there was a more specific and, let's say, a deeper level of analysis around whether travel was really necessary. And so with that, it was a cost savings, but there was also this notion again that I think, they could do a lot of their business via teleconference and not necessarily having to be near an airport where you could fly direct to many points internationally. And so that then really helps us, I think, in a lot of ways, because not only do we have a good, airport that can plug into some of these global hubs for when that international travel is necessary, but it also increasingly focuses site selection for headquarters on some of our other strengths, which are plentiful and I think advantageous even in the COVID-19 environment.
Can you talk about Bunge's history with investing in the St. Louis market with their barge terminal facility in Illinois and moving their headquarters to St. Louis?
Yeah, so my understanding with Bunge is they did have, they have a major barge, terminal facility in Fairmont City, Illinois. And they had a regional office in St. Louis in the Westport area. And then following, the consolidation and the expansion of the headquarters, they've remained, in New York with a presence, but they've moved the headquarters functions to a brand new building and a brand new headquarters along Highway 40 in Chesterfield.
How is the St. Louis regional market positioned to support the shift in teleconferencing in terms of quality of life and talent pool?
Yeah, so again, I think the shift away from having to be near a hub airport and just general corporate headquarters site selection, we have several things now that are areas of strength. They've always been underlying areas of strength, but again, with looking less at that hub component, this just further accentuates our opportunities and our strengths. One of the things this that you always hear about St. Louis is that we've got a high quality of life that's inexpensive. We did hear that some from Bunge already. I mean, they had mentioned that when they came here, there was a cost and a labor savings for some of their white collar employees, and that's part of it. But another part of it is just relative to talent attraction. We have an area that can attract from different parts, both regionally. But when they talked about talent attraction, they also mentioned that this was an area that maybe was harder to attract people to initially, just because of concerns around image, or they weren't executives from overseas weren't that familiar with St. Louis. But once they got here, especially many of them moving from much more expensive markets, and they realized, they had a very robust neighborhood setting, cultural arts setting, a robust food scene, that once they got them here, there was really, it was hard to get them to leave, when their sort of tour of duty was up and they had to go to a different office. And so that's been a big component. We did interview some other companies who gave us very similar themes. We interviewed the CEO of Cosmos Manufacturing, who has been in St. Louis now for about 4 years. And Cosmos is in Wentzville, and they're expanding to a new headquarters in O'Fallon, Missouri. And what we heard there, the gentleman who runs Cosmos, lived in New York. He's from Charlotte, North Carolina. And he had a similar, I think, concern a little bit, when he took the job and whatnot. He wasn't quite sure where St. Louis sort of fit in the equation, and certainly all of his business school friends and that, may have been heading to different areas of the country. And so he came here, and what he's found is it's been a very robust cultural and quality of life environment. Similarly, with the CFO of Cambridge Air, he's born and raised in Southern California, in Los Angeles, moved here in 1987. I think came here, as part of a public accounting job, and really was focused on, being here for that job and, to service a client. And then here we are, some 40 years later, and we're still, he's raised 7 children here, and St. Louis is home. And so I think it's just indicative of, the ability to attract executive talent is a key thing here, and it is a strength that we can continue to focus on and to accentuate and market to the broader world. A few other things related to that. So in addition to the the high quality of life that's inexpensive, we also have a very affordable and qualified labor and talent pool. Again, several of these executives that we talked to noted that, we had the big city amenities, but we were also a very manageable size and manageable scale. It was affordable to find employees, and that certain white collar positions were very competitive, very cost competitive, and that, white collar positions could be recruited very easily, not only from local universities, but also from nearby regional universities to come to St. Louis. As you think about, just sort of travel patterns in general, and certainly for the next few years, again, sort of tying back to our broad airport theme here, one of the things that, when you think about how is business going to be conducted certainly over the next couple of years, I think there's just going to be a natural, aversion, if you will, to getting on an airplane. And even that benefits St. Louis in a lot of ways. Obviously, people, if you do fly, you're going to have to wear a mask. I've seen stories about, possibly taking temperatures and different things. It's all a little bit uncertain, and not to mention just the overall, fear of that I think will still be out there of infection. And so, I envision, several executives, and if they're not doing teleconferencing, they'll be shifting to a model where they'll literally get in their vehicles and drive. And so when you think about how we stack up compared to other regions, obviously we're in the central part of the country, and we can hit much of the Midwest and East Coast. But when you think about where you could drive to within a day, I mean, you could be as far southeast as Atlanta, Georgia in 9-10 hours. You can be in Chicago in less than 5 hours. You can be in other regional cities like Kansas City and Indianapolis in under 4 hours. And so again, I think that's just something, while it's maybe a little bit more of an intangible benefit, it is something that we can trumpet in terms of some of these flight and travel patterns that will change. St. Louis is also a historically strong market for telecommunications in general. I mean, it's a big rail center, so it's also a big fiber center. For example, there's a building in downtown St. Louis that's called the Globe Building, and it actually has 12 fiber providers, all who are providing gigabyte internet speeds. And so it just gives you an example of, the type of infrastructure that we have here. And, this is an area that, you won't have to worry about for reliability as it goes to infrastructure. And that'll be a theme, actually, I'll bring up a little bit later in our talk, Mary, as well. But as it goes to headquarters, as these headquarters are shifting to more of a remote telecom, type environment, that concern is taken off the table. You can also add to that the fact that there is, we are in the central time zone. And so, having done a lot of, national site selection consulting work myself, and just looking at, sort of what does that do for you? Again, it's a benefit because, you can be, up at a reasonable hour, touch the East Coast. You're open longer than the East Coast. Your West Coast colleagues generally are available to get on earlier calls, and then they're also available to you later if you need them. And so that just helps overall, I think, just position this area as a place that can extend the workday as it shifts to teleconferencing and less from the face-to-face business meeting.
I think that's supported with the fact that we've got our 4 interstates that can give you easy access to all 4 quadrants of the United States. And the other part of that theme is we continue to invest in that infrastructure. In the last 24 months, we've invested almost $1 billion in our roadways, and it's a multimodal investment that also includes our rails and our barges and the airports. Doug, let's move on to the second trend. Can you talk about what the second trend is?
So the second trend, and this is probably not going to come as a big surprise to our audience, but the second trend is focused all on risk management. Now risk management has always been a big part of the site selection industry and it's part of any site selection project. In fact, when you think about site selection, it's really about taking risk off the table, right? You start with a large funnel of communities at the top. You go through your analysis as you get to the bottom of the funnel and you get down to the last 1 or 2 communities. By the time you hit the bottom of the funnel, you have taken risk out of the equation as much as you can. Now, there's never a site selection project, even on the ultimate community that you choose, that is without risk. But what I would tell our audience is that this is going to be a little bit different in the sense of the more traditional risk management from site selection. So I think now more than ever, companies are really going to want to have a great handle on where their people and where their assets are, and then also where their future pipeline of talent exists, and generally just being more compact and more focused geographically in terms of managing the value creation side of the business. So while companies and industries will still have to access the world market, they're not going to shut themselves off from their clients and their customers who may be all around the world. What they will want to do, though, for the people side of their business and for the capital asset side of their business, I think they're going to want to have that more compact, less far-flung, more regional in scope, and even more localized in scope. And so I think from that perspective, supply chains are going to shorten, and the areas that are going to do well are the ones that really can effectively serve the world from one location, right? So what does that mean, right? You're probably thinking, okay, what does that mean? So what that means is, and how does St. Louis play into that? It means we have a diversity of economic options and a diverse economic system. One of the things that when you think about our bi-state region and you think about the Freightway region, and I think about some of the other regions that our firm has worked and that I've worked in past roles, across the country. One thing that sticks out for us is, St. Louis as a Missouri and Illinois region is one that's tremendously diverse in terms of its ecosystem and in terms of its options, right? So you can literally have the headquarters to a global company in one part of our region, and then in another part of the region, 20, 30 miles away, let's say, you could have the smokestacks and the factory or the distribution center for that same company. And those are all things that I think, in the current trend line, we can definitely take advantage here in St. Louis. Like we have a very diverse real estate and community ecosystem, let's say, of different communities that really line up well for various aspects of the supply chain, whether it's headquarters, R&D, distribution, or manufacturing. And so I think because we have that as a region, we can really be well positioned for this coming trend, which is not having assets strewn all over the world if you don't need to. If you can run the business and the business can make sense economically to be more compact, which I think some companies are, as we speak, are looking at that very studiously right now. That's going to be that is a big advantage and will be a big advantage for us. We've had, you mentioned the Bunge example, and that's a perfect example, right? So we talked already about their headquarters, move for the various strengths and reasons, moving to St. Louis. And that was one thing, but they also have an R&D center in St. Charles, which they, recently cited within the last, 5 years. The Fairmont City, grain facility. That's a perfect example of, being able to service various aspects of the supply chain all from one metro area. And so, again, I think you could really have a situation where, you might have a DC as far as Greenville, Illinois, or, Edwardsville, Wood River, wherever in the Metro East. And then you could similarly have those assets in Wentzville, and you could have your other assets of your supply chain somewhere in between, right? And so it's a real unique thing that I don't think you see in a lot of other communities. Undergirding that, of course, is this theme of reliability. And, we interviewed several of our companies that as part of our study. And one of the things that came out of that research was, and you brought this up with the investments that have been made, we have a very high quality, robust infrastructure across all different modes. And it's also very reliable. So Bunge, to their example, they pointed out that they actually shift a lot of their grain to Fairmont City because the roads here don't flood and the levee doesn't overtop, right? So that's an example. And compared to other areas that they've been in, that are further south on the river, they can't say that during times of high water. We interviewed a animal health company that's located in the city of St. Louis that expanded and brought its regional headquarters and added some manufacturing. That company's name is Huva Pharma. And they noted that the utilities here were very high quality, that they don't have any downtime. They've had no brownouts or any issues with interruption, and that it's not been their experience in other places that they've been or other places that they've operated. So again, it's a quality assessment, and it's one that I think supports various aspects of the supply chain that we can really talk about and trumpet.
Would you agree that Worldwide Technologies falls into the same two categories as far as the startup of that business, how it's grown and how they've got operations on both sides of the river?
I absolutely would. So, I mean, clearly they've been probably, if you were to look back over the last 20 years or so, I mean, they certainly have been, they are on a very short list of if you were to pick the top success stories, growth entrepreneurial success stories in St. Louis. And for those who don't know, they've obviously got headquarters and major office operations and support operations that are in the Missouri, the Westport area, and in St. Louis County and in Missouri. And then they similarly have very large warehouse distribution and industrial assets in southwestern Illinois. And so that's a perfect example of, again, having various aspects of the supply chain, from the white collar to the blue collar, all up and down, really located and situated all within one area. And that area, our area, our region, has allowed that company to really expand and grow and be the success that they are, because they've been able to do it here. And I think you're going to see more examples of that. And that actually is an example we can point to as well as we're marketing the region for site selection.
Do you want to talk about our industrial heritage when it comes to manufacturing and how that adds value?
Yes, absolutely. So, one of the things that's kind of interesting is, you hear often about, St. Louis, certainly was and still to some regards is an industrial and is a industrial factory town. Obviously we've had have and still do have, the automotive business, the steel industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the consumer products industry, all of those industries, the aerospace industry. I mean, those are all industries that are very big here, that maintain manufacturing, and that, frankly, have allowed for, a very skilled workforce as it goes to the blue collar side of people being able to make things. Flipping that a little bit, though, one of the things that we heard from a company in Madison, Illinois, by the name of Magnesium Electron was they talked a little bit about how they did their site selection, and pointing back to that industrial heritage, they were able to pick up some real estate in Madison that allowed for them to, basically obtain some very heavy industrial capital assets that allowed for them to, really stand up and grow an international business right out of Madison, Illinois. And the thinking there and what the experience of their firm was with that regard was, they were able to pick up these heavy industrial capital assets. So, again, buildings with rail sidings and rail spurs, and buildings with cranes in them and with high bays, and that really supported a prior manufacturing use. And they were able to do that from an inexpensive point of view, vis-a-vis or compared to what they would have spent having done that in a greenfield location. And so, I think it was an interesting conversation, because I think there is a real opportunity here for us to think about as a region. We've had some plant closures or different things happen over the years, just like any community, but we do retain, some really strong and interesting connections to the railroads, to the river, to industrial assets that, can be repositioned and can house a new business. And so I think, those industrial bloodlines and the fact that our communities aren't afraid of industrial development and they're supportive of that, could be an opportunity for us as these supply chains and as the world kind of shrinks and becomes more regional in scope as it goes to site selection.
Let's talk about workforce. Workforce across all sectors is important to supporting a supply chain. Business models in the past have allowed talent to be spread out across the country and in many cases globally. How is the strategy changing, and what is the region's track record for supporting this approach?
Yeah, great question. So it's changing a lot, and I think COVID-19 is really going to accelerate the notion that talent supply chains are getting shorter, and now rapidly we feel like they will shorten even more. So and they have to, right? So when you think about everything that a business is now facing, and again, going back to our risk management point of view, whether that's, hey, we're reopening our office in a few weeks, and how do we manage risk for the 50 people that are coming back, to, hey, we've got talent supply chains and the access to talent and managing that talent from a corporate point of view and an HR point of view is easier and more effective, I think, when you're doing it under, kind of a similar framework and even a similar set of rules and a similar, disposition as it goes to how you're working with your employees and with your HR assets. And so, if you don't need your people all over the world, that's not to say that people won't be all over the world still. There is, some benefit, of course, to being near customers and being in certain markets. But if you don't need your people all over the globe and you can find a way to operate more of your businesses in one area or one region, especially in a time of global uncertainty and international upheaval, you're definitely going to do that. And so how do you down manage the risk, and how do you move it to a location where, the numbers could still work? Well, you move it to an area that supports various aspects of talent. You move it to a region where is affordable, so we mentioned that before, the talent is less expensive than it is in certain areas, and it's also available. And so that, again, plays really well to St. Louis, because I think when we've talked to, various companies, one of the things that's come out is, there's a real culture of work here. When we talk to Cosmos Manufacturing, who I mentioned before, they talked about, his experience, the CEO's experience on the East Coast and in other parts of the country was much more of a experience that didn't involve teamwork. It didn't involve, a collaborative culture. And here there's a culture of work. We talked to a company called Component Bar Products in O'Fallon, who again cited a Midwestern culture and Midwestern values. Regarding, having workers who understand that putting in a good hard day's work will lead to not only their own benefit, but the benefit of their employer, and it provides a stable place that they can go to every day. We talked to Progressive Recovery in Dupo, Illinois, and they as well cited that and these Midwestern values. And so when you think about that, in order to do that, you're going to have an area with obviously a good educational system and good regional universities, which is a huge strength of St. Louis. But you're also going to have some ability to import some workers from, let's say, universities that are a little bit farther away. Let's call it between 100 and 250 miles from St. Louis. And so part of what we heard in several of these interviews was that in addition to, tapping UMSL and SIUE and the local tech schools, Rankin and Southwestern Illinois College, and, schools that are SLU and schools that are in town, we heard a very pervasive theme about tapping schools that are just out of town that St. Louis draws talent to. So whether it was Mizzou or University of Illinois or Purdue University, Bungie mentioned, pulling people from Iowa and Iowa State. There also was a theme of, you can get as good or better talent even from these universities than you would from East and West Coast universities because of that Midwestern work ethic and that culture of work and that culture of personal improvement. So it's a little bit more of a qualitative thing, but it's definitely a theme that we heard almost in every interview. And it's one worth focusing on, because again, you're not going to want to have to go all over the world to find people if you don't have to. And so we're very well positioned, from a talent pipelines perspective, as talent supply chain will shorten. We're very well positioned for that.
You mentioned University of Missouri Columbia, University of Missouri St. Louis, Southern Illinois University, WashU, University of Illinois, and that's where they all have their own version of business school or supply chain. But what's interesting is their target market for students are all very different. And with that in mind, they all work collaboratively together so that we are able to deliver that workforce at the St. Louis region. I think it's also interesting when it comes to our trade programs. Our region is made up of 14 counties from both sides of the river, and that group meets on a quarterly basis to coordinate those efforts. We know when those global companies are looking for that next distribution facility, they're looking for a minimum population. In some cases,
right.
It's a million. We know that when they come to this area, they're focusing on one particular county. It's not because those 2 million population is located there. We recognize it's spread out amongst that 14 to 15 counties. And that's where special thanks to all of them for recognizing that river isn't a barrier and having them work collectively together. And because of that level of cooperation with our universities and our trade schools, seeing past that river, we have been very successful with attracting a lot of those recent developments when it comes to fulfillment centers. So Doug, let's focus on next. We've talked about identifying changes and trends post-COVID and how the St. Louis region already has the backbone in place to support this shift. Let's talk about weaknesses and threats.
Yeah, so obviously, whenever we do site selection, even in a great area like St. Louis, that's got so many good things to talk about, we're certainly trying to understand what our weaknesses and threats are and how we can improve on those. And so the two pervasive themes that we heard, which we believe are interrelated, and they are interrelated, is a lack of pipeline of technical workers. And then also related to that is low population growth. And so what the theme that we heard, out of those two discussions really was, it would be great to get more companies here, and we can position ourselves to be, in the lead and be advantageous as the talent supply chain shortens and as the general supply chain shortens and as people are going to want to be more regional in scope. However, currently what we're seeing is whenever, a company comes in or there is some big, need for technical workers, there also is a little bit of a poaching thing that goes on where companies are competing for workers. And so this appears to be less of in our interviews, it appears to be less of a white collar problem. So I talked a little bit about how we're pulling all this talent from these universities, both locally and regionally. That's not where we're seeing it. We're seeing it much more so in the technical, let's call it the more blue collar aspect of what we're doing here with these companies in this region, people that are, able to tinker with things, companies that, have said, look, we think we could truly grow here, but the lack of population growth, can really be a limiting factor. And so then the question is, how do you mitigate that, or what are some of the things that you can do, and what's a strategy? Now, St. Louis is unlikely, I think, to become the next, high growth city overnight. So one strategy would be you become this place that everybody moves to. And then in some regards, that sort of takes care of itself, right? But I think it's unlikely, especially, in today's world, that you'll see a lot of inward migration to this area. And so then you really have to have sort of a two-prong approach. One is obviously our industrial heritage and the workers that we already have here because of our industry base, but those workers as well will be continue to get older, they continue to age, and so recruiting talent and recruiting companies is part of the solution, but we also need to really push down and think very, very strategically and broadly about how do we fill this talent pipeline. And for that, what we've seen is areas that really go to workforce development, really figure out how to collaborate, how to do some things around where the market's going to be in 5 or 10 years. When we do site selection, whenever we're bringing a client into a region, it's got a manufacturing or some type of engineering or technical side of the business, we're always trying to understand where that pipeline is, right? We're not just looking for that project and the workers that'll staff that place in the next, year or 5 years even. We're looking, much farther out, and how do we make this a successful investment for our client over many, many years. And so part of that is, really trying to go and see what we can do as a community and as a region to continue to push vocational education, continue to push, tech, continue to push, manufacturing as a career. One of the two things that we heard, which was interesting, they were interrelated. Component Bar out of O'Fallon talked about how he has seen, the owner of that company has seen recently a culture shift where, several of his employees and just different people he's talked to in that region and in our region have increasingly become comfortable with this idea of going into manufacturing as a career, right? And that there's less of a stigma around that, and it's increasingly okay. When we talked to Cosmos, one of the things that interview revealed was several of their manufacturing workers, they have an option, let's say, to go to a 4-year college right out of high school, but they've instead chosen to land at a company like Cosmos and learn a skill, learn a couple skills, work hard, move up in the food chain, maybe pursue some education while they're working, and do that, advance and learn and make money at the same time. And so that's a different model than just going right to college. And I think it's one that's been real successful for Cosmos, and is one that would definitely be something that this area would offer. So as much as we can do to promote that, I think is a real positive. I mean, this is a good thing, right? When and we're not just a high tech sector, right? We can be a manufacturing and a high tech sector, and it's a good thing to go into these industries in these communities, because in these various communities, because it could be a real benefit and a good moneymaker.
So the answer is we need to stay the course. We're really close. We've got the resources. We need to continue to focus on those vocational tech schools at a local high school level, promoting those technical schools and the technical post-secondary schools.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think if you were to say, what are our action items going forward? You would have a couple things, and one would be right what exactly what you said, Mary. It would be a review and planning and a stay the course, and even deepen the course around workforce infrastructure and support. So, again, promotion of manufacturing careers. I think we could take a look at doing what economic incentives could be available for various careers, whether it's for educational stipends or companies who work with incumbent workers to get new skills, especially in areas of shortage. So one of the two of the areas that we heard about, one was a heavy industrial electrician positions. That's a really hard position to find and increasingly rare. The other one that was very repeated quite a bit and came up a lot in our discussions was the maintenance tech type position. Again, people that can tinker, people that can fix things and are good at maintenance and good at sort of fixing production lines and being involved on the technical side of a manufacturing business. And so that might be something, as these schools continue to collaborate, it's probably a worthwhile endeavor to engage the local economic developers and engage the educational institutions and politicians and others, political leaders and others who could help drive that kind of effort around workforce. That would be something I would definitely recommend in terms of what we've seen in this area.
And then what about training and positioning?
Yeah. So that's another thing that I think going forward. So if you're looking at, okay, if COVID-19 world supply chain is shortening, the talent supply chain is here, it's in town, and it's regional, and we can attract it here. And then if we can push down and promote additional talent pipelines, so then it's like, what else should we be doing? And probably the biggest thing is, in my own thinking, I believe St. Louis, because of the site selection trends that are coming, is best positioned as it's ever been in the recent future, or recent past, I should say. And then going into the future, it's probably as well positioned as it was back when river transport was the main mode of transport, right, when St. Louis was founded. And it's because we have, again, this diverse ecosystem of real estate, reliable infrastructure, diverse ecosystem and talent base of workers. One of the things that we should definitely make this point is, Cosmos, Progressive Recovery, Magnesium Electron, they are all serving the world from one location, from St. Louis. So I believe Cosmos is in 68 countries, Progressive Recovery and Dupo's in 38 countries with customers, right? So again, you can serve the world from St. Louis. you've got reliable infrastructure, you got affordability. It's a great investment for a very unpredictable world, and a world that's going to have shorter talent and shorter supply chains in a time of great risk.
All right, let's talk about regionalism. I already put a plug in as far as with our workforce diversity offices from our counties from both sides of the river working collectively together. Great example of regionalism. I had mentioned earlier over the last 2 years, our two DOTs, Illinois Department of Transportation, Missouri Department of Transportation, along with our elected leaders, were able to secure over $800 million for Interstate 270. So we've got a great track record at it. To talk about as far as, do we stay the course or do we still have more work to do?
So first of all, it's great to hear that kind of collaboration is going on, and I think that's a model. I hope that stays the course. I imagine it definitely will, but I also feel like we do have some other things that we could do. And I think now more than ever, this just involves, more than anything, it involves just a behavior shift a little bit, right? So we really need to, think about how do we truly think, act, and work together regionally. And when I brought this up earlier about, Missouri and Illinois, and you can have the headquarters and the smokestack, or the headquarters and the big DC, like in the worldwide technology case, all in one area. That was brought up for a reason. And I think, one of the things that and I say this having worked in the public and quasi-public economic development, side of the table here in this region, both in Missouri and in Illinois. One thing I would love to see would be more information exchange, more real estate exchange, and more just broad understanding and collaboration about how certain parts of the region can support various parts of the supply chain versus others. So for example, if you have a headquarters of a company that's maybe in Missouri, let's say, that company, may not be aware of some of the industrial assets that could be available to it should they locate a plant in Illinois. And so, just having the ability for that Missouri economic developer, if they're meeting with that company, to have knowledge of what's available in Illinois, I think would bring more investment and more jobs and just more of a regional approach to economic development. Because when you put it all together, the sum of this region is much greater than the individual parts of its subregion. Now, obviously, we've got great things going on at the county and municipal level that all of us are proud of, right? And that these various economic development professionals who represent those areas are proud of, and that, that's great. But I think in the current world of a shortened supply chain and a shortened and regional talent supply chain, you really do have to think about how do you win more deals, and areas that can present the entire menu and the entire platform and that are going to work together, collaboratively to attract certain investments will win. And then those who don't understand what else is going on in the region or work more on a sub-regional or more on a fractured basis, those are going to be the ones that don't win as much. We've done some work, around the country, but I'm going to use an example that's not too far away. I located a headquarters in Indianapolis a few years ago, and we looked at another community in the Atlantic states for this same opportunity. We looked at St. Louis, and what I would say overall is, the St. Louis region did a very good job of trying to attract that company. But what we noticed in Indianapolis, where ultimately the headquarters went, more so than anything, was a completely unified economic development platform and approach. So we had one person from the state, one person from the chamber, who were our two main contacts the entire time. As we were touring real estate, we actually went to various counties around Indianapolis, and we at no time when we sort of met the local economic developers at those real estate sites and in their communities did we ever feel that, we were somehow being pitched to go to that county versus a different county in Indianapolis. It was all about, hey, we are Indy and we're working together seamlessly and unselfishly. I think there's a lot of good examples of that actually happening in Missouri and Illinois in this area, but it doesn't happen across the state line. And that's really where we need to see more collaboration, in my view. I'd mentioned on this same project that we went to an Atlantic state community, and that community is a very successful region. But in that community, we were actually faced with a sort of one chamber group that had sort of certainly like the city and one of the major counties, and then a different regional partnership kind of group that had the surrounding areas and included that city and county. And it was very clear that those two groups, we almost got handed off, during the project from one to the other. And it was a very clunky handoff. And, we didn't say anything, but our client brought it up saying, we don't see the alignment here. And we kind of feel like this is, not a little bit more disjointed of a community for us that would support our business. And so that really matters. And, I think, again, we've got a great opportunity here, but we really have to think beyond our individual county, beyond our individual state, beyond our individual municipality, and think about us as St. Louisans as a region, because we have a ton to offer. And so that would be my leave behind on this call.
So later today, we're going to release our spring 2020 industrial user newsletter. And in that newsletter, it talks about what a robust market we have. But based on the comments that you shared, we're going to take that under consideration. And I think with the collaboration and the cooperation we have from a public and private sector perspective, and with the track record we have, we're going to take that advice and basically go from good to great.
Yep.
Do you have any final comments?
I don't have any major comments other than I've really enjoyed the conversation. And maybe the other thing I would just leave everybody with is, having done these interviews, and we talked to several companies all within the manufacturing and distribution industrial sector. But one thing that was very clear that came out of really all these conversations was, we really have a tremendous asset here in terms of the St. Louis metro area and the Freightway region and the community that we all call home. Our firm is located here. We work nationally, but of course, we are big proponents of success throughout this region. And, so I want to leave everyone with that, and also say thank you to all the people in regional economic development who are doing such a great job to make this a great community for my family, and then also for everybody who lives here. So really appreciate that, and we'll continue to work hard alongside you to make this as best of an area as we can.
Doug, fantastic. We appreciate your insight from a national and a regional level. We also appreciate your thoughts as far as moving forward post-COVID. So thank you today for your time.
Thank you, Mary.
My pleasure. Today's conversation answers the question, why the St. Louis region for site selection? What makes us different from our sister cities? And the answer is the St. Louis bi-state region can support one system or the entire supply chain, from headquarters, research development, warehousing, manufacturing, suppliers, and logistics. We have the infrastructure, both vertical and horizontal, and the talent. Our workforce has a can-do attitude with a heritage of making things and enabling companies, like we talked about today, Worldwide Technologies, Bunge, General Motors, Progressive Recovery, and others, to compete in the global market, elevating our ranking as a global logistics hub. Our supply chain ecosystem is unique and has adapted to and stands ready for the shifts in COVID in terms of a shortened supply chain and a local workforce that supports each system of that supply chain. That concludes today's conversation. Thank you, Doug, again for your participation. We will also release the Spring 2020 Industrial Real Estate Newsletter. All of our FreightWeekSTL 2020 activities are helping improve the movement of freight through innovation and advancing the industrial user market. Thank you to all of you for your help with the Freight Week. We want to thank our Freight Week participants, our FreightWay committee members, and the industry for your continued collaboration and partnerships that are supporting the global supply chain during a very unprecedented time.